This is the first biography of Charles Diggs Jr. Why did you write this book?
Well, I had learned about Diggs for many years. I learned about him when I was an undergraduate student, and I knew he was very consequential and very important. I went to graduate school, and I still learned more about the congressman. And when I discovered that no one had written a book on Diggs, I decided that I should write one because I knew of his significance in American politics.
Yeah, I mean, he's the first black Congress member out of Michigan. He worked with Martin Luther King Jr. He founded the Congressional Black Caucus. He was a big part of advocating against apartheid in South Africa and advocating for democracy across the many nations of Africa. So he seemed pretty consequential. Why do you think Diggs isn't more well known?
One of the things that I believe happened is that, Diggs was in office from 1955 to 1980. A good many of the years when he was there, there was another Congress member named Adam Clayton Powell, a black Congress member from Harlem. Many people who know Congress during this period think of Adam Clayton Powell first than, let's say, Diggs. I think in large part, Diggs was sort of quiet, unassuming, and I believe overshadowed by Powell and perhaps others. And the other thing I would say is that Diggs had, at the end of his career, a downfall that I think may have tarnished his reputation.
Yeah, and we'll get to that downfall. But I'm glad you talk a little bit about Powell and the differences between him and Charles Diggs' politics. You write a few times throughout the book that Diggs practiced a strategic moderate politics. Moderation today, at least, is a little bit of a dirty word among progressives because it signals to people that they're not willing to stick their neck out and stand on their values. What do you mean when you write about Diggs' strategic moderation?
Yeah, I argue that Diggs in Congress worked the institution, and he worked in Congress, and he practiced what I call politics of strategic moderation. Now, what I mean by this, I don't use moderate in the same way in which you describe it. That is, members of parties trying to distinguish themselves from the extreme wing of their parties. They say, "Well, I'm a moderate." That's not what I'm saying here. Diggs was a moderate in that his approach to pushing civil rights and issues, for example, in Southern Africa, his approach was trying to build a broad-based coalition, a broad spectrum of people supporting the cause around civil rights. So when I say he practiced a politics of strategic moderation, what I'm trying to say is that his approach was to build these broad-based coalitions. Diggs could work with conservatives, and he could work with militant black radicals, and he demonstrated this throughout his years in office.
How did he do that? How did he build coalitions? How did he get people who disagreed with each other under the same tent?
It was part of his approach, his demeanor as an individual. I think he really had this capacity to work with a wide range of people. So part of it was this sort of personal demeanor. The other part was just his understanding of how the legislature worked. The founding fathers, the framers of our Constitution, designed Congress to be an institution of bargaining and compromise. And Diggs functioned quite well doing those kinds of things. That's how Congress is supposed to work, compromise and bargaining. You don't see much of that today, but that's what Diggs practiced.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit because I in reading your book, I was thinking about Diggs's politics and how he went about what he did. And it was a very, very different media environment. You write that, he put his head down, he listened to folks, he kept communication channels open and tried to build coalitions, but he wasn't a media hawk. He wasn't going out and trying to get the attention of reporters a lot. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, that was a different kind of media ecosystem. Today, representatives get a lot of attention and praise sometimes for using social media channels and being very loud on them, but not necessarily getting laws passed. I'm wondering what politicians today can learn from Diggs's politics, and can those politics even be achieved in a media climate like the one we have now?
Well, you're absolutely right. The ecosystem for journalism and media has changed dramatically over the past many, many decades. But one of the things I think that's important, Diggs did use the media. I mean, he was not afraid, for example, to reach out to reporters that he knew, especially in the black press, if you will. But Diggs really, again, tried to build these coalitions both within Congress and outside of Congress. He was very, very well known to advocates, reporters, and others who were outside of the Congress. So he had these kinds of friendships and networks that allowed him to maneuver through Congress and outside of Congress.
What was he doing, though, to keep all of these folks under the same tent? I guess I go back to this because I'm wondering if it's about the issues, if it's about the way he carried himself. What was the thing that held people together here?
Well, it's partly the cause. I mean, a lot of people were pushing for civil rights in the 40s and 50s and 60s. The other piece was the fact that Diggs had strategic positions within the Congress that pulled people into his network and orbit. For example, he was strategically located, or positioned rather, to fight for Southern Africa because he was a prominent and senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. At one point, he would in fact chair the subcommittee on Africa, which gave him a unique and strategic position to fight and mobilize around the anti-apartheid movement. Similarly, in his efforts to restore home rule in Washington, D.C., Diggs, again, was strategically located and positioned as chair of the House District of Columbia Committee, again, to pull in folk who were trying to advance local democracy and to restore home rule in Washington, D.C. So part of it was his building seniority and building strategic positions within Congress, which pull advocates and others into his fold.
I'm wondering how much flack he got for this. I mean, there were a lot of really heavy debates in the black community in the 40s and 50s about how to achieve black liberation in the U.S. I know these debates still go on. There are some folks that I think understandably didn't want to work with white people because they didn't believe that they could be taken in good faith. That wasn't Diggs's strategy. And I guess I'm wondering if he got flack from the left wing, you could say, of the black vote for some of these stances.
Yes, he did. As the number of black members of Congress expanded, when Diggs came into office in 55, there were only 3 black members of Congress. But as the decades went along, more and more blacks would come to Congress, and many of them were younger, more vocal, perhaps more militant than Diggs. But many of these folk understood Diggs' position in Congress. He understood that Diggs was well-liked. Although he was not one of the boys, if you will, in Democratic leadership, people liked him. They worked with him because he was this serious policy-oriented legislator. Now, you're right. There were real fractures within the black politics in the 50s, 60s, indeed the 70s about the right approach and right direction. Diggs, however, stood firm. Diggs believed firmly that the best vehicle for black advancement in America was the Democratic Party. And he wanted to bring as many people as possible under the Democratic fold. This is why I spent some time on that chapter about the Gary Convention in 1972, which was an effort led by Diggs, along with others, to bring together this broad coalition of blacks, the ideological fractures within the black community.
I imagine that was hard sometimes for him to hold that tension.
But when you look at Diggs, for example, he worked quite well with Amira Baraka, who at the time was the nation's most prominent black nationalist, to pull together this National Black Convention in Gary in 1972. I think that's an example of Diggs' ability to work across ideological spectrum to push forward on the issues that he felt was important.
And I know you were saying that he used his platform in order to bring folks in and get them, I guess, sitting at the same table, or at least listening to, each of them and then pooling their ideas together. Was his demeanor a little bit softer at times? Like, I think this is a very hard thing to do, to hold the politics of many different people, of many different blocks inside one individual. And I do think about today where it's just so easy for people to yell at politicians and leaders in a way that it wasn't before. And I'm not saying that leaders and politicians shouldn't be criticized, but the access, the avenue to which to scream really loudly is very different today than it was before. I guess I'm wondering what you think allowed him to hold the many different politics of many different people and to push for what he thought was right while doing so.
Yeah. Well, I think part of was his moral clarity. The issues that Diggs mobilized around were issues that he could gather, again, this broad coalition. He was very clear, for example, in terms of fighting racial discrimination and segregation in the southern airport terminals. What he did was made it very clear that these kinds of segregated institutions supported by federal dollars really was morally wrong and really violated what America stood for. So part of it was indeed the moral clarity of the issues that he pushed and rallied behind. For example, what was happening in South Africa with apartheid. He was pretty clear that America should not be aligned with the South African regime, which allowed for this system that suppressed and subjugated the majority of the population. So part of it, I would argue, was the moral clarity that he laid out when he mobilized around these issues.
This is the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm producer Sam Corey, and I'm speaking with Marion Orr, a professor at Brown University and the author of the recent book, House of Diggs, which is about Michigan's first Black Congressmember, Charles Diggs Jr. I want to go back in time a little bit, Marion, and talk about Diggs' family for a second. His great-great-grandmother, Lily, worked as a house slave in Kentucky and was sold to Mississippi. She learned to read and write and then established a secret night school for slaves, teaching them to read and write. I'm wondering how much you know about her story.
Well, her story is laid out by historians who've studied education efforts down in the South. And there's a book called The Midnight Teacher, which is about Lily Grandison. And you told the story correctly. She was a slave at first in Kentucky, and the children of the white slave owners taught her how to read and write. She was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, and at night she ran a slave school where she taught slaves how to read and write. This is all documented by historians who study the early education of African Americans in the Deep South. Mm-hmm. This is part of what I argue is that the deep DNA of Diggs around public service. Public service runs deep and long in the Diggs family, and the slave woman you just mentioned is just one of these examples.
Yeah, it's a pretty remarkable story.
It is a remarkable story. And let me just tell you this. She actually, according to the historians, she actually got caught teaching the black slaves how to read and was prosecuted. And according to the historians, she was defended and was found not guilty because the laws at the time stipulated that slaves, in fact, could teach each other how to read, but not a free person. So she actually got off on doing this. Yes.
Wow. And the jury was presumably all white or mostly white?
Well, they dropped the prosecution when they learned that she was not in violation of any laws. The laws prevented free people from teaching slave people how to read. It did not prevent slaves from teaching other slaves how to read.
So as you're saying, a public service, really big part of Diggs' family history. Of course, Diggs Jr. grew up in the 1930s Detroit. What was the city like during that time, and how did it shape his politics?
Yeah, Charles Diggs Jr. parents were part of the Great Migration. That is that exodus of lots of black folk moving from the Deep South moving up north to the Midwest and indeed out west. So Diggs' parents came to Detroit and they formed what became a prosperous funeral home called the House of Diggs Funeral Home. And at the time, it was really a growing black community in the area called Black Bottom on the east side of Detroit. And the Diggs family, having formed this very prosperous funeral home, became part of the black elite by the 1930s and early 40s. And the father, Charles Diggs Sr., would parlay the success of the funeral home into black politics. So what you had was a growing, vibrant black community in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Many of the blacks who had moved from the Deep South, escaping the racism and the economic oppression there, and seeking opportunities in the auto factories and the like in Detroit.
And of course, the family eventually moves to the North End. They're having so much financial success. Diggs Jr. goes on to go to the University of Michigan, and as you write, he experienced a lot of racism there, so much so that he decided to transfer to Fisk University, which is a historically black college in the South. This was during the Jim Crow era, and one of the things I'm wondering is just how the anti-black racism was different and similar in the South versus that of the North at the University of Michigan.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. The racism that was there at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, was very difficult for young Diggs to maneuver. And you're right, he did, in fact, decide to transfer to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. There you had a clear state-sanctioned segregation. I have letters that young Charles Diggs wrote home when he was a student at Fisk, explaining to his mom and to his father about how he and his friends could not go into certain stores, that they had to go up into the balcony when they went into the theater. And so for Diggs, this was really a different kind of racial segregation and racial discrimination, unlike what he experienced in Detroit. This was a state sanction. It was very, very tough and difficult for blacks living down in the South. And Diggs would experience this not only at Fisk, but he was also experienced this when he goes down to Alabama during World War II. And these experiences in the South, I would add, would really shape his approach to Congress and the kind of issues he would work on when he goes to Congress.
I guess I'm wondering what the differences in, I appreciate that. I'm wondering what the differences in his experiences is, again, between the North and the South. He seems to be one of the few black students at the University of Michigan. And so even though the laws are anti-discriminatory in a way that they're not in the South, he maybe doesn't have the same kind of peer supports there. I almost wonder if the situation kind of gets flipped on its head. Like in the North, he doesn't maybe have many friends or peer support, and he does culturally face anti-black racism, but the laws aren't as racist as they are in the South. And in the South, the laws are very racist. It's codified in anti-black racism.
Right.
And so in the institutions that he goes to, he is discriminated against. And yet at the same time, he's at a historically black college. And so he has peer support of black people who not bigoted in the same way that the folks up north are. Is that a fair comparison?
Certainly. He certainly, you're right. He finds a totally different environment when he goes to Fisk. He finds the supportive professors there who are encouraging him. He, in fact, would get so excited he would write back to his parents that he, was enjoying himself at Fisk. In fact, he wrote saying that he was thinking of joining one of the fraternities there on campus. You certainly can see that the environment was such that he really began to enjoy college and to enjoy his work. And there's a large part because of the supportive nature that historically black colleges have always provided black Americans. He found that there at Fisk. And that's why many black leaders would, go to schools like Fisk and Howard University to get that kind of support. He thrived during that short period that he was on the campus at Fisk. But as you know, it was interrupted because of the start of the Second World War. He was drafted and went into the war.
Skipping forward in time a bit, Diggs, of course, becomes a state senator, and then he ran for Congress. He had to overcome a lot of racist propaganda that was thrusted at him in that race. He had to win over white voters. He had to beat the son of the former owner and editor of the Detroit Free Press, which I thought was remarkable. So there was probably a lot of favorable articles that were written about his opponent. How did he do this? How did he win this race?
Well, he won the race, first of all, by knocking off a sitting incumbent Democrat in the primary. He came out of nowhere and defeated George O'Brien, who was the Democratic Congressmember from the 13th District. He surprised O'Brien with his insurgency campaign. Now, the district that Diggs was running in 1954 was a district that was 60% white. It was a majority white district. But Diggs had the support of what I call in the book the coalition of black, labor, and liberal whites. That is, black American voters. He had support of the labor unions and liberal whites who supported his candidacy. So part of this was the fact that Diggs was able really to draw off the strength of his father's reputation, number one, and secondly, to build off this coalition of blacks, the labor unions, and liberal whites that began to dominate Detroit and indeed Michigan politics beginning in the late 1940s. So he would defeat the Republican nominee, who really was a somewhat lackluster candidate. He was, in fact, the son of the Free Press, the newspaper owner, but Lanny Knight was his name. Lanny Knight was really not a very strong candidate, and Diggs campaigned really hard in the black community, and he campaigned hard in the parts of the district that were largely white, and built this really broad coalition that got him elected.
This is the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm producer Sam Corey, and I'm speaking with Marion Orr, professor at Brown University and author of the recent book, House of Diggs, which is about Michigan's first black Congress member, Charles Diggs Jr. You know, Diggs goes on, he advocates for civil rights, including the Voting Rights Act, for non-discrimination in the military. He founded the Congressional Black Caucus. He did a lot of coalition building. We've been talking a little bit about that. He was also one of the first legislators to be interested in Africa and in African politics. He wore a pin of Liberia on the lapel of his suit jacket. Can you briefly talk about how he tried to change America's stances towards countries like Ghana and South Africa? I know you mentioned this earlier, but I think this is a really important part of his politics and probably a part of America's shift, at least in part, towards countries that exist in Africa.
Yeah, Diggs would become one of the first American legislators to demonstrate a genuine and continuing interest in Africa. Diggs went to Africa for the first time in 1957 to witness, as a part of the official U.S. delegation, the independence ceremony of the new nation of Ghana in Africa. And so he went to Ghana in 1957, and he was just taken away by what he witnessed there. And he came back to the Congress, came back to D.C., and asked the House Democrats to change his committee assignments. And he asked to be a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And so in 1959, Diggs became the first black American to serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And that happened because he took this trip to Africa in 1957. In 1969, Diggs would become chair of the House Subcommittee on Africa, that the Foreign Affairs Committee Subcommittee on Africa. Diggs would, early on, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, began to talk about what was happening in Southern Africa, especially South Africa, where, as we said earlier, apartheid, that system that allowed the white minority to rule over the black majority there. And so he would just simply begin to focus a lot of his energy, a lot of his effort, his policy focus began to zero in on Africa, so much so that by the 1970s, he was known as Mr. Africa because he had become the Congress member who had taken more trips and more study missions to Africa than any other Congress member in the history of the U.S. House. So, yes, he began to talk about apartheid and focus on it. It would be his greatest challenge and indeed his greatest accomplishment. That is trying to move our nation away from the apartheid regime in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, he was also, I'm sure, in part an educator on things that were happening in Africa and in African politics. I mean,
this is true. He would hold hearings as a chair of a subcommittee. You can call hearings. You can ask the executive branch to send Secretary of State or Assistant Secretary of State and begin to hold hearings and ask questions. And this is what Diggs would do as chair of the subcommittee on Africa. He would really awaken America about what was happening in Southern Africa and especially in South Africa.
Yeah, and so in the story, I mean, President Richard Nixon appoints Diggs Jr. to the U.S. delegation to the United Nations, which is a huge deal. Diggs resigned from the position, the first delegate to do so, because of America's support for African nations that were anti-democratic and continuing to worsen the conditions of lives of Black Africans. I want you to talk a little bit about how this was a part of his strategic moderation and I guess his moral values leading the day for him.
You know, Diggs had become the delegate to the UN, and although he was a UN delegate, typically UN delegates followed the lead of the administration, and Diggs, of course, could not do that with the Nixon policy, and he really used the resignation from the UN, again, to highlight what was going on in South Africa and what was going on in Southern Africa. And he was really doing this as a protest to bring attention to the country about the Nixon administration policy toward South Africa. You see, while Diggs and now other advocates were trying to pull our country away from the South African regime, the archive documents show letters whereby our nation, indeed our president, was trying to pull us closer to the South African regime. Mm-hmm. South Africa was, as a government, was strongly anti-communist. Mm-hmm. And so our nation, under Democrat and Republican presidents, viewed it as a Cold War imperative that we align ourselves with South Africa because South Africa had become such a strong anti-communist nation. So we were in bed with South Africa in large part because of the Cold War imperative.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about this calculation, though, because he's got to make a hard decision here. I mean, you're saying that he got attention to South African apartheid and to continuing colonialism in Africa by stepping down from the position of the U.S. delegate to the United Nations. But he steps down from that position, so he no longer has that platform. He's got to balance that against staying sort of in that position and trying to leverage his position status, which he does elsewhere, to try to move the needle. I'm guessing he didn't think he could move the needle anymore, and so he thought that the best thing he could do was just to call attention to how bad the situation was.
No, I think you hit it right on the head there, that he viewed Kissinger, the Secretary of State, and President Nixon as being, strongly aligned with the apartheid regime, and he had real difficulty breaking that. I mean, Diggs had really worked to sort of inform Kissinger and Nixon what was happening there, and they simply ignored his policy recommendations and ideas, although they at one point told him that he would be consulted, on these matters. Mm. And so when it became very clear to Diggs that Nixon was really not willing to change the policy, he made the decision to call a press conference and to announce that he was resigning as a delegate from the UN. Now, recognize that when the UN Charter was established back in 1945, I believe it was, they established a tradition whereby president would appoint members from the House and the Senate to be a part of the UN delegation. And traditionally, the president picked both a Republican and a Democrat to be a part of that delegation. These delegates really did not have a sort of policy implementation role. They were there really to sort of advise the president and the Secretary of State. And so Diggs used this really as a way to dramatize what was happening in South Africa and to bring again to the nation's attention the fact that our nation, which supposedly stood for democracy and freedom, was aligned with this racist regime that subjugated the black majority in South Africa.
And that was his best political card. I mean, he couldn't stay in the game in that position in the same way because he just wouldn't have accomplished what he wanted to.
No, the idea here is you got to bring pressure because, see, Congress nor the administrations were moving on South Africa. This is why I say this is Diggs' biggest challenge and his biggest accomplishment. Diggs was pushing against his own party in the House. The Democrats in the House were also aligned with the South African regime. And so Diggs recognized that if you're going to move Congress, you have to have pressure on the outside. This is very, very important in terms of how Diggs operated. This is why he formed this group called Trans-Africa. Trans-Africa, which was Diggs' idea and Diggs' vision, was formed in 1977. And Trans-Africa became this nation's most important anti-apartheid organization. And Diggs had a vision of forming Trans-Africa because he knew and understood if you're going to move Congress, you really have to have pressure on the outside. In addition to moving and maneuvering on the inside of Congress, Diggs understood the value of civic organizations and protest groups pushing on the outside. So his resignation from the UN, you see, would rally these advocates outside of Congress to push the administration to do more to sever the ties between our nation and South Africa.
And of course, years later, the South African apartheid does fall.
Yes, it would take some time. It would take many decades. This is why I'm trying to emphasize this is one of his greatest challenges. Because let me put it this way. If you look at Diggs' work in civil rights, trying to break down the legal segregation that existed, you could probably make the argument that our nation, America, was moving in the right direction. 1948, for example, President Truman desegregated the U.S. military. In 1954, Supreme Court ruled that legal segregation in schools were unconstitutional. You see the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The point I'm making here is that when you look at Diggs' work in civil rights, you can probably say, oh, the nation was moving in the right direction. Not so with South Africa. Not so with South Africa. Our nation was not moving in the right direction, and I would argue, had it not been for a person like Diggs, who was pushing us in the right direction, I'm not certain we would have moved as quickly as we did. That's why it took so long for this to happen. We didn't get sanctions on South Africa until the Reagan years.
For all the awesome things that he aspired for and that he achieved, you write about his personal life and how it was kind of a mess. He cheated often. He wasn't always around for his kids. He had a problem spending beyond his means. His family's business, which is not exclusively his fault, but starts to fall awry. He eventually developed a payroll kickback scheme in Congress and then got incarcerated for it, which led to him resigning from office. I guess I'm wondering how much of the issues in his personal life came to negatively impact his professional life.
Well, it brought his career to an end. There's no question about that. But listen, when I talk to people who work with Diggs on Capitol Hill, and I talk to Congress members and I talk to staffers who work with him, they all stress how effective he was as a member of Congress. They all stress how serious he was in terms of policy issues. So when you ask whether or not his personal challenges affected his professional life, I would say, well, it brought his career to an end. But in terms of his working on a daily basis, working for the people of Detroit, working on issues like civil rights, working on issues like South Africa, Diggs stood out as an effective fighter and warrior for freedom. So from what I can tell, it had little bearing on his professional life other than it ended his career when it came to light that he was involved in this kickback scheme.
Well, then I guess I'm wondering if it's maybe the opposite. Maybe it's that because he invested so much in his professional life, his career, and in public service, this wasn't, of course, just for him. This was for millions and millions of people he was advocating for. But because he put so much into that, he maybe let his personal life go unattended to.
Yeah, this is really an interesting way of thinking about it. And one way I think about it is that he really made a significant sacrifice. Now, he made these decisions, but he really sacrificed his family, and he really sacrificed, as you indicated, the family business. And he sacrificed both of these in large part because of his work in D.C. and around the world. I guess it's really a part of the sad part of the story, if you will, is that he really worked hard to advance civil rights. He really worked hard to change America. He really worked hard to bring freedom to blacks in Africa. And I document that he was successful in that in many, many respects. Yet his personal life was a challenge. He was a very, very dedicated, patriotic person, hardworking guy. But he also was imperfect. He also had some real flaws. He gambled a lot, you see. So, he really had some difficult personal challenges. But I say that the personal challenges affected his personal life. It does not, I would argue, negate the tremendous contributions that Congressman Diggs made and left, and the kind of legacy he left.
Yeah. What do you make of this tension, though? I guess we only get one life here, depending on what you believe. What do you make of all of the awesome things that he fought for and accomplished, and yet, because of that, not investing as much of his personal life? That dynamic between caring for public service, caring for one's profession, caring for dedication to others broadly, but then because of that, not being able to invest in the same way privately and in the people that were close to him.
Well, I think about the quote from Brian Stevenson, the author of the book Just Mercy. He said somewhere in that book that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And that's the way I look at the congressman, that we all would not want to be known for the worst thing we have done. We are much more than that. When you package the full Charles Diggs Jr., you see more than the downfall that people remember. In fact, when you look at this book that I published, House of Diggs, a great part of the chapters that I cover, there are about some 23 chapters. I think 20 of the chapters are all about the accomplishments this man made. So when you look at him in the fullness of his life and look beyond just the sort of worst thing that he ever did, and that was this payroll kickback scheme, we have to get past that, and that we all we all would not want to be looked in that manner. We all would want to be seen in the fullness, and I think this what I'm trying to do in this book is to have people look at all of Charles Diggs, not just the payroll kickback scheme that ended his career.